Hello, everyone. I'm Ty Steele. Here on Local 4 Plus, we're taking you to the Detroit Economic Club for a look at where Michigan's economy stands in the year 2025. A panel of experts is talking about ways to grow jobs and bring new business to the state. Let's take you there.
91 years of speakers, and those speakers tell the history of our country. And January 21st is a very popular date in the DEC's history. Quentin, Rachel, and Gabe, our panelists, now join a distinguished list of 16 others who spoke on this day at the DEC January 21st. Beginning way back in 1935, a U of M economist named Professor Ira Scharfman addressed Detroit leadership on ideas to lead Detroit out of the Great Depression. And in 1963, the president of the American Medical Association delivered a speech titled Medicare, Boon or Political Fraud. And here we are 62 years later, and some might ask the same question, right? 1980, chairman of General Motors, Tom Murphy. 1985, this one was big, President Ronald Reagan on our stage. 2003, U of M President Mary Sewell Coleman, and 2011, Mayor Dave Bang. And today we're pleased to add Quentin, Rachel, and Gabe as our 17th through 20th speakers on this day in DEC history. Let's congratulate them with a round of applause. And finally, we want you to use your smartphone to be involved in the program, take lots of pictures, share with the hashtag Econ Club, and you can also submit a question for our guest using the QR code you see on your screen. And those questions will make their way to our presiding officer, who I'm about to put to work. Mike Land is the Metro Detroit Market President for Huntington Bank. He is a DEC board member, an amazing supporter of the DEC and me personally, and so vital to so many things in our city, region, and state. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mike Land.
Well, thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, DEC members and guests, and Happy New Year. Thanks again for venturing out on this very cold morning. We appreciate everyone making the effort, and we got a great turnout here today, it looks like. It's my privilege to introduce today's roundtable. So first, Quentin Messer Jr. is the Chief Executive and Economic Competitive Officer of the MEDC and Chair of the Michigan Strategic Fund. Messer is charged with executing MEDC's core mission of business development and attraction, community development, providing access to capital, and enhancing Michigan's image and brand with a focus on building a strong and equitable economy for all Michiganders. Messer received a BA from Princeton University and his JD and MBA from Columbia University. Rachel Eubanks is the 47th Treasurer of the state of Michigan. She is committed to bringing creativity, collaboration, and commitment to identify and implement solutions to some of Michigan's greatest challenges. Rachel is a graduate of the University of Michigan with a bachelor's in economics. Next, Dr. Gabe Ehrlich is the director. He's got a long title here, but he's the director of U of M's Research Seminar in Quantitative Economics. Ehrlich oversees forecasts of the U.S. and Michigan economies, and he presents regularly to the Michigan legislature and governor about Michigan's economic and financial prospects. Gabe received his PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. Our moderator today is a familiar face to many of you. Daniel Howes is senior editor and business columnist at the Detroit News. Daniel holds an bachelor's degree in history from the College of Wooster in Ohio and a master's in international affairs from Columbia University. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm Detroit Economic Club welcome to our roundtable. Excellent. Okay, this past November and December, Many of you participated in the 13th Annual Michigan Economic Outlook Survey. The survey was authored by David Baker from the Baker Strategy Group in partnership with the CFI Group. Here to unveil the survey results, please welcome David Baker.
Hello. We are delighted to present the results of the annual Michigan Economic Outlook Survey. Our esteemed panelists today will provide the insight on Michigan economy. My job is to simply present the results from what we heard from our respondents. Before we begin, I just want to quickly thank Steve Gregorian and the Detroit Economic Club for help over the course of this program. And thanks also to Diane Keller, Sherry Petrus, David Ham, Don Hart, Jimmy Shao, Brad Smith, and Vicki Amungan, who were instrumental in helping us get set up. So today is the first day of a new administration with economic expectations ranging from thrilled to frightened, many simply uncertain what it will mean for the broader economy. But for today, in this survey, we focus on our wonderful state and on a purpose I believe is unifying across political and economic perspectives: how we can continue to make Michigan a great place to grow business. The survey always begins 1 week after the election day, which in 2024 was November 5th. Survey participants work in areas across Michigan, with most respondents coming from the lower half of the Lower Peninsula. And as you can see, the three sectors, business, nonprofit, and government, map pretty well to the actual labor force. As for measurement, we borrow an approach used by Ann Arbor-based consulting firm CFI Group, co-founder of the American Customer Satisfaction Index. CFI Group asks questions on a 1 to 10 scale for greater measurement precision, then translates the results to a 0 to 100 scale. These are what we use to report the results today. Generally, you want the scores to be in the high 70s or low 80s. You kind of think of it as a temperature. And today's 5 degrees would be a terrible economic outlook. As for, our survey is a tracking measure. It measures aggregate of how individuals feel about their own company's economic outlook. Respondents are asked about the company's outlook for the next 6 months, 12 months, and 3 years. And as you can see, from 23 to 24, we saw a bit of a spread between short-term and long-term. 6-month outlook dipped to 67. 12-month outlook remained at 71, while the 3-year outlook rose to a balmy 75. In 25, we see these three measures tightening again. The 6-month outlook leaned up to 68, the 12-month softened slightly to 70, and the 3-year outlook slid down to 72. There seems to be a bit of optimism in early 2025 with an improvement, but there's still a great deal of uncertainty about overall economic conditions. We did ask a few individual perspective questions as well on a Likert scale. 44% viewed Michigan 2024 economy positively, compared to 33% who viewed it negatively. And 2025 looks a little bit better, with half of the respondents positive and 30% negative. And as for the impact expected from the president's policies, respondents are split, with 41% positive and 43% negative. Notice, too, that the two extremes are quite large, 16% extremely positive and 21% extremely negative. And finally, let's get back to the final tracking measures. Michigan, as a great state for raising a family, has always stayed in the 70s. It happens to be in the low 70s now. And on one hand, scores remained low for a vibrant economy and a great state for young professionals. On the other hand, respondents see some improvement with Michigan as being a business-friendly and on the right track. So I asked ChatGPT, I put in the prompt for this meeting, and I said, ChatGPT, who would be better, you or this panel today at responding to the Michigan economy? ChatGPT gave me 3 reasons why the panel would be better: real-time data and policy updates, insider perspective, and Q&A opportunities. ChatGPT was right. I'm handing it back over to the inimitable Daniel Howes and our esteemed panelists. Thank you.
So what I want to ask you is what your reactions are to the survey. Any surprises, Rachel?
Sure. You know, the first thing that stands out to me, I think, is, and this is a conversation we've had for the last several years as economists and revenue forecasters, is trying to, reconcile the difference between the data that we see and the sentiment behind what people are feeling. And, we talk about this a lot at the state level because it's very predictive of our sales tax performance, is consumer sentiment. So consumer sentiment, is sort of on this downward trajectory. It's recovered, a little bit recently, but it's been bouncing around generally in that neighborhood. But at the same time, that hasn't seemed to have changed people's behaviors. They have not stopped spending. We continue to see sales tax, kind of at its pandemic levels highs, although it's somewhat flattened out. But it certainly hasn't retracted in a way that you would think of someone who says, hey, the economy's not doing well, I should pull back on some of my activity. The same thing seemed true. That was my first reaction of looking at some of the business sentiment that the survey demonstrated. This period of time, that we've seen sort of some negative perceptions has been at a time when we've seen record tax collections on the corporate side coming into Michigan. I mean, for example, the corporate income tax in Michigan around the 2020 timeframe was about $1.1 billion. Now it's well over $2.2 billion. So in a 5-year period of time or 4-year period of time, it's doubled. And you would think, given that we're assessing corporate income tax on corporate profits, that, that would be perceived as a good climate if you're profitable. But there doesn't seem to be that correlation. And I found the survey to be interesting in demonstrating that, although, of course, I would love to know more of the reasons why.
But organizational, some of the organizational outlooks, and when I went back and looked at them, from 2020, there was a 15-point slide from 81 to 65. That's a pretty, now obviously there was a pandemic in the middle of that, but what do you think describes or explains that, Gabe?
Yeah, I think the first thing to acknowledge is the economic conditions nationally have been tough for Michigan. It's been a tough economic environment for Michigan. Depending on how you measure it, you could argue that the manufacturing sector has been in contraction for 2 years now. And so of course that's going to be tough for Michigan. We've got high interest rates. That's tough for manufacturing. That's tough for the local mortgage industry. And so that, it is what it is. That being said, Michigan's economy has continued to grow. We did add jobs last year. We had a little bit of a growth wobble in the middle of the year last year. The last couple of reports have been very positive, though. We're expecting growth to continue this year. But I think that when you put those trends together, you can see why there's a little bit of a mixed reaction in the survey data. Listen, we've been facing a tough environment for Michigan. We do expect to get some relief going forward. We expect growth to continue, but we also expect it to slow down as we continue to put the pandemic in the rearview mirror and approach what you might think of as full employment.
What are your thoughts, Glenn?
Well, look, I think I have a lot of thoughts, but let me try to summarize 3. Look, there are a lot of things for which we can feel good, but there's still work remaining to do. That's 1. 2, I think that as we continue to build upon, which is a very diversified economy statewide, it is still overly weighted to the manufacturing sector. But I think what we should be thinking about is, how do we win? We have to make our piece. We know how to do deep tech, hard tech well. How do we leverage technologies to move to the most profitable and more recession-proof elements of that sector, rather than walking away from manufacturing? And I think the last thing I will say is, I was especially looking at about the young people. I still continue to challenge us who can influence young people, and we have folks, young people from Eastern Michigan, University of Windsor. What are we saying to them about Michigan? I think we have to be careful not to impose our biases upon young people in a way that I think is detrimental and may cloud their judgment about really what is some tremendous opportunities here.
As someone who came in from the outside a few years ago, what do you hear Michiganders, or Michiganians if you're a Detroit news reader, telling young people?
Well, I think that, obviously I'm going to have to generalize. I think a couple things. I think things do break across racial and gender lines. So I think that, there are a lot of folks of color who felt that maybe they, for a while, maybe up until the 80s, this was the place to be, and then things changed. And so everyone moved to the ATL or moved to H-Town or moved to Nashville. But those places aren't nirvanas either. I think people still complain too much about the cold. As someone who's a native Floridian and moved up from Louisiana, I just wear layers here and keep it moving. And I think the last thing I would say is you're now, and despite whatever disappointment we have for the Lions, I think the Lions' success, the resurgence of the Red Wings, the Tigers, and the Pistons, Michiganders and Detroiters have always been winners. And I think you have to, no matter what is facing you in immediacy, you have to keep that winner's mindset. And that's just something that, if you're in the South and you're losing, you kind of you're like, that's just a temporary thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's just a very different mentality.
You're right in the middle of business attraction. Do you think Michigan is more attractive to do business today than it was 3 or 4 years ago? And if so, why?
I would say absolutely. I think there are a couple of reasons. I think through bipartisan expansion of the toolbox that we have here. I mean, recently passed Innovation Fund that's going to spur entrepreneurship and innovation. Reinstitution of R&D tax credit would make sense if you're trying to get those higher wage, higher order knowledge jobs here. And given just the fact that we do deep tech and hard tech well, just 2 quick other things. I think business leaders here are much more conscious of their role as ambassadors, maybe in a way that previously it wasn't front of brain.
No,
but I always tell people to take the Texan test. If you're on the plane and you're sitting next to a Texan and you don't have on noise canceling headphones, they're going to convince you to move to Texas or try to. And that's a very powerful thing that we have to embrace. And I think the last thing is, I think that we have made important investment in becoming a state of lifelong learners. There's work that we need to do in pre-K through 12, but we have incredible 2- and 4-year institutions, and I think we've begun to better harmonize the efforts of that sector with the broader economic development and policy efforts.
I'd like to ask the 2 of you to kind of set the economic table for us a little bit. A couple years ago, we met here and agreed that we were amid an environment, what did I write down? An environment of ongoing rapid change. We now just had a new president inaugurated yesterday who has some policies, I think, that will, and we'll get to that will affect Michigan and its main industries. But maybe in some ways you feel like it's trying to slow things down a little bit in some ways. Is that still true? Are we still in this period of rapid change, irrespective of who's in the White House?
I mean, I think we certainly want to see what is going to be the policy initiatives that do come forward. I think being 24 hours into a new administration, it's difficult to know, sure, what are those policy initiatives that are, going to move forward and to what magnitude, and then for us to be able to take a look at it and quantify it in terms of what it means for Michigan's economy and revenues. I will say we just came off of the state's revenue estimating conference. The forecast, we did make some assumptions related to, the expiring Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I mean, because in addition to, there's been a lot of conversations about, tariffs and other policies, but I mean, clearly the core of the tax plan will be revisited because it's expiring. It has to.
Right.
And so making some sort of assumptions that, it'll continue to some effect. We had to do that to come up with an economic forecast. But generally, I mean, the state's coming at it from a very strong and stable economy. And then that allows us to be nimble and I think reactive in a way that perhaps in other times of uncertainty, we have not had that ability.
Well, how can you explain this kind of, you touched on it earlier, this kind of contradiction between what people say, how they feel, and what the metrics that we look at as the strength of an economy are. And it would appear that the metrics are pretty good for us. Interest rates are still staying up there. They're not moving as much as people had hoped. How do you explain that?
Yeah, so
either one of you.
You want to start?
Yeah, sure. The first thing I'll say, I think it's a fantastic question. If somebody wants to write a dissertation on that question, come on. We've got the University of Michigan Surveys of Consumers that my colleague, Dr. Joanne Shu, runs, and she was at the Revenue Conference earlier this month. And I truly believe it's an open question. That being said, the one thing we know is that people just really dislike inflation. They hate it. And so I think that that's the most important, number one reason is, when you look at, the cost of things that you buy, on a regular basis, when you look at eggs, that's the one I hear the most. It just drives people crazy that they can't count on costs, being predictable. I also think, if you're trying to be, a first-time home buyer in the housing market, I think that that's a tough situation to be in right now. Obviously prices have risen, quite a bit. Mortgage rates remain high. So, some people are getting frozen out. But the reality is when you look in the data, people are not acting as though they're so unhappy with the economy. Business formation in Michigan remains very strong. So the Census Bureau measures applications for new businesses. That surged after the pandemic. It remains high. It's bouncing around in a range. It was down a tiny bit last year, but still very strong. So I do think that there's a disconnect. I do think it's a puzzle, and I would love to, talk with anybody who wants to come write papers about it.
Is Michigan's, and I know you've touched on this before, is Michigan's population growing?
Yeah, so Michigan's population actually grew quite a bit last year. It was good to see. The downside, if you will, or the asterisk, is that more than all of our population growth came from international immigration. So if you look at domestic migration, so people moving across states, we lost more residents to other states than we gained from other states. And we also actually had more deaths than births last year. So Michigan's population grew quite a bit last year. We think that a lot of that, really is about immigration, about the surge, obviously, in immigration that we have seen recently, and we expect that to moderate going forward.
What about the labor market and housing? I mean, they're both pretty tight, aren't they?
Yeah. And I'm happy to yield the floor anytime, but the labor market has actually cooled off considerably. It's still a healthy labor market, but it is not the same job seekers market that it was a couple of years ago. And that gets back, Daniel, to your question about are we still living in a time of rapid change? I did want to reconnect to that. When you look at the labor market, actually, churn in the labor market has slowed down quite a bit. So people are staying in their jobs. 2 years ago, people, there was a ton of turnover, tons of job vacancies. People were moving around. That was the way to get raises. Now you're seeing, people look at their jobs and saying, maybe I should hang on to that.
And I wonder if, some of the, the churn and turnover in the jobs market has contributed to some of the negative perceptions about business climate in Michigan. If we were coming off this period of time where for the first time we had, more job postings than job seekers in a very long period of time. And we understand, that would be very difficult as an employer to navigate. If it's the investment you have to put in new staff, the training that happens, the economic components of that. And so, as businesses are looking at what does my workforce look like, do I have, the right compilation of people in the right places, and what is the turnover going to look like? That does seem like that could potentially contribute to, hey, I feel like I'm operating in a negative business climate.
Let's talk about the elephant in the room. We got a new president yesterday, and he spent, and his opponents spent, I think they had Uber or Airbnbs rather in Michigan. They were here so many times. We counted them up. I think it was 50 or 60 times between the two of them. It was ridiculous. But many of his policy proposals, a lot of them are focused on our bedrock industry and can affect our bedrock industry. And I kind of want to get your take on that and what that may mean going forward. We know what he said. We don't yet know what's going to be done, and those are two very different things. Many of his proposals cut to the heart: trade, tariffs, emissions, electric vehicle incentives. What's your initial take on? Do you see this as a negative, and it could be disruptive, or a net positive, or maybe just a net zero? Start with Quentin.
Look, we all want and wish the Trump-Vance administration to do well. We as Americans need them to do well, and we're hoping that they do well. I'm always going to see it as a positive because President Trump understands that Michigan will always matter electorally. And while he won't be on the ballot in 2026 or 2028, certainly the legacy he's trying to build will be. And Michigan is going to be important. I think the treasurer said it best, and Gabe has also said, it's early. I think that, Mario Cuomo once said, you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose.
Right.
And I think the complexities as information and the Trump-Vance administration do their due diligence, will become apparent, especially if you areas of tariffs. But I'm optimistic because the president is smart and he understands that Michigan matters. And not only just Michigan, but there is an entire I-75 automotive corridor, as well as a coalition of southern states. So the auto industry isn't just Michigan anymore.
Nope.
It is nationwide. And also, I think the piece that I have to be better about articulating, and I think others have to, the automotive industry, the innovation in that sector catalyzes innovation and brings people to the party that then go ahead and innovate, whether it's in fintech or insurance tech or other consumer durables. So I think that virtuous cycle will become more and more evident as the president digs in, he gets his economic team engaged, and we continue the process of continuing the dialogue that has to occur, not only with the president, but leveraging our very influential federal delegation.
You deal with businesses all the time. I think it's fair to say that we've made this transition from the Biden administration to the Trump administration, and the pendulum swung very rapidly, and you see that in some of the actions that the president's already taken. Is there any scenario you can think of where that's good for business? Because you're going from one extreme to the other. Electric vehicles, EV incentives are two good examples.
Well, look, Michigan never had an EV mandate.
Right.
Full stop. And I think if we just, focus on just the auto sector for a moment, there will be some suppliers who will welcome the slowing of the transition to electric vehicles. But there will be other propulsion systems. And so I think there will be some that will be happy about that. I do think that the Trump-Vance administration will have a federal industrial policy. They have said they want to bring supply chains home. How they do it in clean tech, how they do it in semiconductors, how they do it in defense and aerospace, how they do it in mobility, they have to flesh that out. Let's give them the time. I think it's not even been 24 hours.
Right.
So I do think there are opportunities for success. And more importantly, let's just be real. Success is about not complaining and just seizing the moment. And I think Michigan businesses have proven time and time again, they're not going to waste an opportunity. And I think that there are things that this current administration will do that will be of great benefit to Michigan businesses. And I trust Michigan businesses will figure it out. And I, as a policymaker and an MEDC, have to come alongside for that journey with them.
It just strikes me that we're at a moment where the competition with China, for example, in the industry is getting more intense. There's a constancy behind what the Chinese, and a very methodical, unspooled, you know this very well, and yet our companies, both foreign and domestic, are operating in an environment where it's changing all the time. Not all the time, but it's changing a lot. And these are some pretty extreme swings. That has to affect businesses, doesn't it, Gabe?
Yeah, so I think, one thing I would say, businesses are aware of this dynamic. They know that the pendulum is going to swing back and forth. And, businesses, they can see the future, and they know that at some point the pendulum might swing back the other way. So, I understand what you're saying and your concern, but, I also think that, being forward-looking, I don't think that people, for instance, are going to abandon EVs just because, federal policy changes from one administration to the next. I do think we'll continue to see the transition. Obviously, the pace of the transition is going to depend partly on federal policy. So I think, that's the first thing I'll say. The other thing I'll say, I work in an economics department. I've got to stick up for textbook economics a little bit. So
I'm going to ask you a textbook question in a minute.
All right, then I'll wait on that then.
No, go ahead.
Oh, fine. Just to say, I thought the survey results about, the administration's policies were really interesting, and I think they really reflect that we don't know, what the new policy is going to be. And, obviously there are announcements, but that's different than the actual policy when it's all said and done. And there's a negotiation, right? And so, we don't know everything that's being discussed, in private. We only see the public part of the negotiation.
Well, and people I've talked to who work for the president in his first term will tell you that these policy positions that he articulates are often, in his mind, opening gamuts in negotiation. They're not hard and fast, this is what we're going to do. Yeah, I'm reminded of a conversation I had with Sergio Marchionne after Trump was elected the first time. And we were up in Mackinac Island at the Grand Hotel, and I asked him, I said, what are you going to do about this guy? And he said, just looked at me and he said, he's the president, we adapt, which I think is what we're talking about here. And I think that's where you are. Gabe, I'd like you to take us, getting back to textbook, give us 2 minutes on how tariffs work, what their record of effectiveness is in the United States, and could they be a benefit to the Michigan economy as early as this year?
Sure, yeah. So thank you for the easy question.
Is that a layup?
I appreciate that. This is no,
but there is economic orthodoxy, is there?
No,
not?
there is. Yeah, there is. And look, I'm happy to be the person to stick up for it. Listen, tariffs, to the extent that there is protection for the domestic auto industry, other things being equal, that can help Michigan, but other things are not going to be equal. There's really three main effects, and we saw this in the first Trump administration. In the 2018 and 2019 trade war, we can expect retaliation from our trade partners, and we can expect impacts on the supply chain. We can expect production costs to go up. So when you look at the most recent trade war, so to speak, a round of tariffs, what we saw is that those two other effects, rising input costs and retaliation from our trade partners, generally outweighed the domestic protection effect. And so I think, honestly, at the end of the day, a lot is going to depend on the details. It's early to say what those will be, but I think it's really important to keep in mind, look, it's not going to be all else equals. We're not going to be able to get protection for the domestic auto industry or for domestic manufacturing without paying a price.
Rachel, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I think Gabe touched on it so well. Being a student of the economics program at University of Michigan, I appreciate the response. I think, the industry that we have here in Michigan is complicated. We've got a very complicated supply chain network. We know that there's various implications that will occur depending on the tariffs. And Gabe pointed out, it's not necessarily directionally obvious depending on the way that the tariffs are designed. I'm certainly happy, one of the things I think that gets lost in the president's announcement of the tariffs yesterday is he did ask for data from key department heads to be supplied to him and relatively quickly in the next couple of months. And we're hoping that that data will be really reflective in understanding our economy here, the importance of the tariffs on our supply chains, the importance of protecting, jobs and working families, and keeping costs low. The uncertainty, of course, doesn't just impact businesses, but consumers as well. And if, there's concerns about, what tariffs could be, could that change spending patterns or, just the timing of purchases? I mean, that could be something to think about as well. But I'm certainly happy to hear that they're taking a data-driven approach.
But I think we said here a minute ago that consumers hate inflation. And aren't tariffs considered inflationary?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to again stick up for yes. I think that in general they will drive up costs to consumers. Tariffs are a tax that consumers pay, and there's a lot of theory, there's a lot of data work. In principle, the cost can be shared between people in the United States and suppliers abroad. But at the end of the day, I would expect some increase in costs from the tariffs.
Quentin, you and I've talked a lot about competition and the work you're doing with hunting, being the big game hunter, as it were, for investment. Is Michigan, do you think, more competitive for jobs and investment than it was 2 years ago?
More
competitive.
Of course, the answer is yes. And I just want to challenge the premise of the question. I mean, we have to win both chunk plays, to use a football analogy, the big game, but we also have to be willing to be able to move the chain and not turn the ball over. So that's why you have to have an innovation fund. That's why you have to have the R&D. That's why you have to have the business traction and community revitalization budgetary item that the legislature passed every year to support incumbent Michigan business. It has to be an and. And I think, yes, we're more competitive than we were 2 years ago. Do we still have work to do? Yes, I'm not going to be satisfied until we're number one. But I think you can see an undeniable upward trajectory, but we still have work to do in order to get to where we need to be.
So it's kind of an all of the above strategy here. It's not just trying to hit the home runs, to borrow another sports analogy. I mean, it's
You have to be able to win multiple ways. You have to be able to go to baseball, my weakest North American sport. You have to be able to hit the home runs. You have to also be able to win a shutout, and you have to be willing to play small ball. You know, you get a single and you move over and be able to play disciplined, mistake-free. I think the biggest thing that I would leave the members of this group, let's not make any self-imposed errors. If we can play error-free, I will take Michigan's hand against any of the 49 states and all the Canadian provinces and all the Mexican states. Because the one thing in all, you talked about the methodical nature of China, explosive creativity. We can create trunk plays. They're going to have to move to change. To use a football analogy, my favorite sport, it is tough to replicate 10-play, 80-yard drives.
right.
And do that 3 or 4 times. But that's why you have a Jamil Gibbs. That's why you have a J-Mo, because they can get those chunks, those explosions. And I think that is still a big part of who we are as Michigan and who we are as Americans.
You have, since the thing you and I are not supposed to talk about, that thing that Ford did down south a few years ago, there have been some major investments in the state. 2 that I would bring. One is Ford at Marshall, and the other is Goshen and Big Rapids. And both of them, to my surprise, and I've been covering business here for 30 years, the opposition that started to well up against those local opposition, I found very surprising, because I think historically those kind of investments in Michigan would be warmly greeted. I'm curious about what you think is driving that, and is this, and I've seen this in other parts of the country. I mean, there's been some stuff in Georgia pushing back against, I think, a Rivian operation. Again, a small bucolic town in central Georgia that doesn't want this kind of, that's why they live out there. What's driving that, and what does that tell you about kind of economic development challenges in Michigan this year and going forward?
You know, I think every local context is case specific, but I think in general there are 3 things. Once upon a time, there used to be an implicit assumption for economic developers that growth was good. All communities wanted to grow, and that you didn't need to make the case as to why a community should grow. I think that's one. You have to make the case. 2, I do think that with the proliferation of information, I think facts are relatively unmoored from reality, that people can fill a void with information that is unmoored from reality. And it's difficult to, once you get something set in your mind, it's difficult to change your narrative, even if you are presented with a universe of facts to the contrary. And I think its last thing is this issue of expectations. You know, I think there are some communities, or some people, let me not say communities. I think it goes back to that survey question about young people. What are we saying to our young people? What are we saying about our expectations for what's possible? And I think some people sort of say, look, you know, I went through the hard times, and I'm good. You know, the scar tissue is built up. We are where we are, and, you know, people have a remarkably high pain threshold. And change requires a commitment to deal with some unknowns. And we see people say, you know, that's okay. I'd rather deal with whatever limitations in my current environment, because I know it.
A follow-on to that is you're playing, I'm sure, spending a lot of time playing in the electric vehicle space, meaning looking for and trying to win investment. Do you see that has peaked, or is it still very intensive behind the scenes? you know, the industry's pulling back a little bit. You've got a new administration that I think clearly wants to refocus on the traditional auto industry, fossil fuels, internal combustion engines. I mean, that's what the president has talked about. What Detroit needs to focus on is build the things that make money for them. And it's not a bad argument, but it's a question of whether it's either or and. But I'm curious as to whether you see a pullback in the EV space.
I think you've seen a realignment based upon market signals. EV sales are growing year over year, but they're not growing at the rate that maybe some of the build out for some of our tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers. What you're seeing some battery makers do is begin to look at other project lines. And I do think energy storage, you know, you're seeing battery makers moving to that, and the treasurer in her prior roles knows more about that than I'll ever know. But I think you're seeing people be creative. Let me just say this. We have to be able to go and compete in multiple different venues and areas. Period, full stop.
Interesting. I have a question for you, Rachel. There's new leadership in the legislature. And how do you expect that to impact economic development in the state, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think the governor has a great track record of working with a divided legislature. That was the first 4 years of her administration is doing that, and I think she had a tremendous amount of bipartisan success moving bills across the table. And I know that she's reached out to the new House leadership and intends to work very closely with the new speaker and trying to move some of these initiatives forward, these critical initiatives that Quentin has talked about. So I'm certainly optimistic that as Michigan will continue to work together just like we have in previous years.
I think we're up against time here, so I want to just ask one final question of each of you. What do you think is the greatest or are the greatest, singular or plural, threats to the Michigan economy in 2025? Rachel? You want to pass?
Dave, why don't you go first? I'll come back. I'll come back to me. That's a hard one.
Yeah, I think one thing is we do need predictability in what, trade policy is going to be. So, I've kind of stuck up for the textbook, so to speak. I understand the real world is complicated, but what I think the unpredictability, really runs a risk. And there is a little bit of a game of chicken that can happen with our trade partners. And that I think can really create uncertainty. It can, lead people to wonder about investments. So I think to me, the unpredictability is a big risk. And then the other is, just the business cycle. What would happen if we do have a national recession?
I should ask you, that word didn't come up, but do you see any credible case for recession in 25?
It's always a risk. I don't expect a recession in 2025. That's not our base forecast. But, that risk is always out there.
Quentin, biggest threat?
Yeah, I think the biggest threat is our inability to reconcile that we need all of our sectors firing, whether it be agribusiness, tourism, and especially the auto sector. Our inability to make sure that we're prepared policy-wise. I'm not afraid of the outside. I'm afraid of what's in our own heads about who we are.
Right. Well, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
All right, I think a great discussion so far. Wouldn't you agree? So we got a few questions. Go ahead. So we've been monitoring. There's a few questions from the audience that I want to ask the panel here. So one that was coming up quite a lot here in different forms was inflation, unemployment, and interest rates. So I think I'd like to ask the panel in 2025. What is our view on where do we think inflation is going to be? Where do we think employment may end up? And if you have a crystal ball, where you think rates may be in 2025?
Yeah, well, actually, Gabe and I work very closely on these forecasts. And in fact, a big part of our economic forecast that we have at the state level that helps predict revenues actually kind of builds off his model. But I will say, I think there is some expectation that the Fed will continue to try to prioritize the controlling of inflation through their policy levers, but we still are expecting to see another couple of cuts. It may not be as many as what we had thought, a year or so ago, but certainly that will still be built into the forecast. As far as unemployment, I think unemployment, we're anticipating to stay sort of in that 4 to 5% band. It's, moved around a little bit. Again, as a student of economics, we were always taught that 4 to 5% unemployment was in fact full employment levels. So seeing it in that neighborhood seems to be sort of a really healthy level. And inflation, it has, moderated, and hopefully it will continue to stay at that level. Goods actually have sort of entered a deflationary period compared to, services where we're still seeing a lot of the pressures there. But I think overall, seeing, inflation kind of maintain around the level it is what's built into our forecast. Did I just say your entire forecast, Gabe? Sorry about that.
No, you said it beautifully.
Anything else, Ed?
I should have taken more economics courses in undergrad or business school.
Okay, my next question, I'm going to ask each of you to opine here for about 30 seconds or less. As we look into 2025, are you bullish? Are you neutral? Are you bearish? Where are you at? Quentin, we'll start with you.
Bullish.
Bullish. You can expand a little bit if you want.
I'm sorry. No, bullish because, look, I think where you have the underlying fundamentals are sound. I think you have new leadership at the federal level, which will shake up things and create new opportunities. And I think that our companies, our workforce, they're prepared and built for whatever comes. So yes, I'm bullish for those reasons.
Gabe?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I do expect growth to continue in Michigan, a little bit slower than we had last year. But I do expect us to the state to continue adding jobs. And along the lines of what Quentin said, I think that people are prepared for this environment. It's been a tough environment in Michigan, and we've hung in there as a state. I think things should improve some as we move through the year. As Rachel said, maybe a little less quickly than you might hope, but we do expect some improvement.
Great. Rachel?
I might say this a little differently than the way that Quentin said it, but I am incredibly optimistic. I think we are so much more resilient as an economy, than what we've seen historically. Gabe, you mentioned this very briefly, but just to expand on it, seeing our growth in the less cyclical job sectors, that doesn't necessarily mean industries. I think, a lot of the contraction that we saw in auto manufacturing, on those more true manufacturing jobs versus the R&D, some of the, other positions which are definitely more resilient. So I think we've, reshaped our economy in a way that, continues to become more and more resilient over time. And I know that we have a lot of fears as Michiganders about, how bad recessions have been for us in the past. And I think as we continue to go through this work, as Quinn continues to do his excellent work and bringing in, employers and expanding employers that help us create that resilience, I think we're going to continue to thrive and a more variety of economic conditions than what we have previously.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now it's time for our lightning round. So I'm going to hit you guys with some quick questions, and if we can just do some quick answers back as we run around. So the first question I would have is, what did you want to be when you were growing up? Rachel, I'll start with you.
I think probably like many other kids, I was given a menu of like doctor, lawyer, you know what I mean? And I think I always wanted to be a doctor until I went to go take, organic chemistry classes. And I realized that that was not for me. So I ended up still trying to help people through government, but I do that through a finance and math lens where you don't quite get as dirty on your day-to-day job.
Gabe?
I always thought I would be a lawyer because I like to argue. I found economics. You can argue with numbers. It's been great. So.
NFL strong safety.
Well, we could use some of those too. Person other than your family member you would like to have lunch with? Quentin?
Herbie Hancock.
Gabe?
Wow, other than my family member. I was, That's a tough one. I don't get out that much, but but I'm gonna pass to you, Rachel.
Yeah. You know, just because it seems sort of out there, I would say Alexander Hamilton. I mean, why not? To get a sense to, you know, have a chance to talk with the first Treasury Secretary in the United States. He might have a few words of advice for a treasurer like myself. So I'm going to say Alexander Hamilton.
Gabe, if you want to have lunch someday.
Yeah, love to. I was going to say, you know what?
I wasn't off the table for an answer, by the way.
I'd love to get lunch with the president and the board of regents at the university and you know, hear about their thoughts for the university and what it does for the state.
Sure. Yep.
Gabe, I feel like we could make that happen. I feel like that's.
They're it's
Okay, how about this? If you could trade places with someone for a day, who would it be? Go to Quentin again.
Dan Campbell.
Oh, interesting.
wow. Yeah, that's a great one. I'm not going to argue with that. I'll go ahead and say Sharon Moore.
Okay.
Oh, okay. I'll stick with the sports team and say Caitlin Clark. All right.
All right, and one more here. I got two more, actually. Describe Detroit in one word.
Urbane.
What was it?
Urbane.
Oh, urbane.
Resilient.
Yeah. I think inspiring.
Great. Nobody said grit. I was wondering if we were going to get grit, so great. Okay, and the final question I have for all of you, what advice would you give your 25-year-old self? Rachel, I'll go to you.
Sure. You know, I think I would tell myself that, you know, you can do so much more than what you think you can. I think our young people, you know, can have a little bit of a blockage of confidence, and I think the more you go out there and challenge yourself, the more you realize what you can do.
I would go ahead and say, you know, don't stay behind a screen, whether it's in your work life or your personal life. You know, get out there.
Yeah, I guess quick three-parter, move to Michigan earlier. The second is become someone that can be counted upon. And then third, express gratitude.
Great. Can we give a hand to our panelists and our moderator?
Thank you, Mike. All right, I'm going to close it out quickly. Quentin, Rachel, Gabe, you guys were so insightful. Thanks for being with us. I was backstage feeling really bad for you, Gabe, so how about I'll email you, we'll pick a date, I'll come to Ann Arbor and take you to lunch. How's that? Good?
Sounds good.
All right, thank you guys for being here.
Yeah.
Daniel, David Baker, Mike Land, thanks for your important roles and for your support of the DEC. Ladies and gentlemen, we invite you to network and enjoy a strolling lunch in the ballroom right outside there. But first, tell your friends and colleagues to join the Detroit Economic Club. We're a bunch of really good people. So, on time, every time, this meeting of the Detroit Economic Club is now adjourned. Thank you.
This is all part of our partnership with the Detroit Economic Club. We're bringing you more of these conversations throughout the year, streaming right here on Local 4 Plus. Thanks for watching.